All right, video one. Feeding and maintaining the starter. This breaks down into a couple things that you kind of want to do some groundwork in the beginning. One of the first things you should probably consider is the container that you're putting the starter. The tiny jar that you currently have the starter in is good enough for the beginning, but whenever you get into bread baking, hopefully that's where this leads, you're gonna want something a little bit taller and bigger, because as you can see, it does go up, and you do need a certain amount of grams for the recipes. So you're gonna use a lot of that space. So a good tip to do is, once you kind of land on the jar or container of choice, maybe want to get kind of a baseline. I went ahead and just measured what mine is, and that comes into play a little bit later when you're trying to figure out how much starter you need for that day's baking. So first step, with people who don't make bread every day, you and I, the thing that is really convenient is that we can store the starter in the fridge. You can leave it in there all the time, but you do need to make sure that it is fed at least once a week. This is just to make sure that the bacteria and the yeasty things that happen within the leavener, the starter, survive. And that's kind of it. The cold kind of puts it in a kind of a hibernation kind of state. So what I do is that I make bread every week, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. If you don't think you're gonna make bread every week, what you'll want to do is at least bring it out to feed it once a week. So you'll bring it out of the fridge, put it on your counter, let it get to room temperature, and then you're gonna want to just feed it an equal amount of flour to water. For if you're just kind of maintaining it, you're gonna want to probably do small amounts, because you don't want to waste a whole lot of flour. If you are making bread, then you may want to do larger amounts, 100 grams, 150 grams. Whereas if you're just kind of maintaining it, 20 to 30 is probably enough. But grams, that is. But if you but what is pretty important is the ratio of starter to water and flour. So let's say, and this is where we get into the weight of the jar. So if I go ahead and weigh my jar with the starter that is in there, we see it's around 183. So you do some math, you end up getting around 117 grams. Now, before this video, I went ahead and I got rid of some starter, and that comes into play because your jar's not big enough to kind of just keep adding 100 grams of flour and water every time you do it. So there is a process to kind of burn some starter. Now, there are a couple different techniques. The one I use most of the time is just put it in the garbage. There is also, we've learned by a dude's video on YouTube, of frying it up with some herbs or some certain things, and it kind of comes like almost like a quick bread. So we pulled some aside for later use, and that will be video 2 of the day, where Shalane fries up some starter to show you what that looks like. So for this process, I am going to make starter, or I'm going to feed my starter. And this is what you do on a weekly basis, just to keep it alive. So we're gonna tare it, get it to 0. And what we're gonna wanna do is, I like to start with water, because it's the water is a little bit more difficult to measure and pour out of a container. So I went ahead and did some prep and got 100 grams of water. And as you remember, let me just kind of stop. As you remember, I do have 117 grams of starter in there. The hydration between the starter and what you're adding it to, you kind of want that to be a 1-to-1. So we want it just helps with the moisture of the bread later on, but that's we'll get into that much later. So I have 100 grams of water. I'm going to put it in. Give or take. It doesn't have to be kind of an exact science. You just kind of need to be in the ballpark. Now another reason I do the water first is because I like to kind of mix the starter with the water to kind of loosen it up. If not, it kind of globs up. And so you kind of get a good mixture. Now you can use a spoon with this, but I have discovered that I have much easier time doing it when I use a chopstick. Less thickage because this stuff does get kind of thick. So you kind of want kind of like a little slurry like this. And there you go. That's step one. Next step is the flour. You can use kind of whatever you want with this. I only use white flour in my starter. It's kind of a personal choice. Sometimes I get a little tired of wheat, and I like to, if I am going to use wheat later on when feeding for bread, I can do that. But for the most part, my main batch of starter, I use white flour, and that can be just regular AP, or that can be bread flour. This is what I'm about to put in is AP, just all-purpose flour. So put that to 0. Gonna put in 100 grams. And there we go. So mix it all up, kind of get everything incorporated. The the chopstick also helps with scraping the sides because the things do get kind of messy within the jar. Another trick is if you kind of want to keep track of how much the starter has risen in a particular time, you can get a container, or like a container with some measuring on it, or some kind of hash marks. Or another thing you can do is you can kind of just get yourself a piece of tape. I don't know if I can find it. This much problem. Just kind of a piece of tape, and you can kind of mark it where the line level is, and you can see that. So right there, and that's kind of it. So I just tend to just put a lid over it, just something loose, or you can kind of just put a paper plate over it, or just some kind of lid, and you put it aside. Now, if I was just feeding this to maintain it, I would let that feed for 6 to 8 hours, just out of the refrigerator, and then I would put it right back in the refrigerator until next week when it was time to feed it again. I will be checking this in about 4 hours, because that's when I've noticed on mine that's the 4 to 5 hour mark is usually when it's ready to start making bread with it. So I like to, as soon as I mix it, start a timer, just so I can keep track of things and know when to start doing other steps in the process. So that's feeding and kind of maintaining. I I think that's it. I'm sure I've left something off, but maybe we can swing back around and catch some of those steps on other videos, or maybe later today in Shalane's frying up starter. So hope you guys are good. Talk to you soon.